At 52, nobody plans on being erased. Nobody spends 23 years pouring herself into someone else's life only to watch it all get stuffed into one suitcase, while a younger woman's laughter drifts off the porch that used to be hers. The world sees a woman like Sarah, cast aside, swapped out, left holding almost nothing, and assumes she'll disappear quietly. They figure her chapter's done, but they overlook something fundamental. When you strip a woman down to bare ground, you haven't hollowed her out, you've unchained her. You've handed her the terrifying, beautiful freedom to find out what she can forge with nothing but her own hands. What Sarah built in the forgotten belly of the city didn't just keep her alive. It proved her real life hadn't even started yet. If you believe that those who tear others down eventually face a reckoning of their own, go ahead and subscribe. What Robert found when he came looking for her 3 months later will stop you cold. Hit that button if you hold that the universe keeps a long ledger. Give this video a thumbs up so it finds the person who needs reminding. Being knocked to the ground is not the same as being finished. Because what Sarah constructed in the dark went far beyond survival. It was a quiet, devastating education in turning someone's cruelty into your greatest weapon. Sarah Mitchell stood on the pavement outside the home she'd lived in for 23 years. A locksmith was drilling new deadbolts into the front door. Once her door. Not anymore. The divorce had been signed 3 days earlier, and after 23 years of marriage, after she'd shelved her own career so Robert could chase his business ambitions, Sarah walked away with almost nothing. Robert's attorneys had been ruthless, expensive, clever in ways that felt surgical. They argued the property had been purchased solely in Robert's name before the marriage. They proved his business assets sat locked inside trusts Sarah never knew existed. They catalogued, line by line, her minimal financial contribution to the household over the past decade. The court granted Sarah $60,000, gave her 30 days to leave. Robert kept the house, worth $2.8 million, the vacation property, the investment portfolio, and the cold pleasure of watching his 52-year-old ex-wife walk out with nothing. Now Sarah stood on the curb, gripping a single suitcase and the carrier holding Mina, her black cat, her only companion, and watched Robert step through the front door. A woman half his age hung from his arm. "All done?" Robert asked the locksmith. "Yes, sir. New locks on every door. Here are your keys." He took them with a grin that stretched slow across his face. Then his eyes found Sarah, still standing there on the sidewalk. The grin widened. "You're still here, Sarah? I figured you'd be gone by now. Don't you have somewhere to be?" Sarah said nothing. She stood straight, her dignity the one thing no lawyer had managed to strip from her. Her hand rested on Mina's carrier. ___quote_3__, Robert went on, pitching his voice loud enough to carry, loud enough for every neighbor watching from behind their curtains. Quote 4, quote 5, he leaned into it. Quote 6, quote 7. Across the street, Mrs. Chen had stopped pretending not to watch. Heat crawled up Sarah's neck. "The settlement money should carry you a few months if you're careful," Robert offered, his tone bright with instruction. "Maybe find a little studio apartment. Get a roommate. Learn to live small," he laughed. "Who knows? Maybe losing everything will teach you the life skills you clearly never picked up." The woman on his arm let out a soft, careless laugh. Sarah knew her. Amber, one of Robert's junior associates, 28 years old, blissfully ignorant that Robert would shed her with the same cold efficiency the moment someone fresher appeared on his horizon. Sarah said quietly, the first word she'd spoken since arriving, "The divorce is not concluded." "Oh, my dear," Robert replied, his voice dripping with manufactured pity. "The divorce is definitively concluded. The documents are signed. The settlement is final. You have lost. Accept it." "We shall see," Sarah answered. Robert's face turned to stone. ___quote_16__. Sarah lifted her suitcase in one hand, Mina's carrier in the other. She walked down the sidewalk with her chin raised, past the neighbors peering through their curtains, past the wreckage of everything she had built, toward what, exactly? She had $60,000 in a bank account, a suitcase of clothing, a cat, and no place to live in a city where a studio apartment devoured $3,000 every month. The math was brutal and simple. Her settlement would stretch 18 months if she barely ate, barely breathed, barely existed. And after that? At 52. No recent work history, no references Robert hadn't poisoned, no circle of friends beyond the society wives who had dropped her the instant the divorce papers surfaced. Sarah walked for hours. The suitcase grew heavier block by block. Earlier that week she had called friends. Every one of them claimed to be busy. She had reached out to former colleagues from before she'd left her career to prop up Robert's ambitions. They had moved on, claimed not to remember her, were not hiring. By evening, Sarah found herself in a part of the city she rarely visited, the old financial district, where buildings from the 1920s stood shoulder to shoulder with glass towers. The sidewalks had emptied after business hours. She lowered herself onto a bench, hollowed out with exhaustion, and unzipped Mina's carrier to let her breathe. Mina purred against her palm, the only living thing offering love without conditions. "We are in serious trouble, my dear," Sarah whispered. "I have no idea what comes next." As the sun dropped behind the skyline, Sarah noticed something she had never seen before. A metal grate set into the sidewalk beside the old Merchants and Trust Bank. Rusted, half swallowed by weeds at its edges, nearly invisible. But there was writing on it. Faded letters, barely legible. Metropolitan Transit Authority service entrance. Authorized personnel only. 1932. Sarah remembered reading that the city contained dozens of abandoned subway stations, sealed since the 1940s when the transit system was modernized. Stations that still existed beneath the pavement, forgotten and locked away. This grate looked as though no one had touched it in decades. But when she crouched closer, she saw that the padlock had corroded almost to nothing. She glanced around. The street, empty, twilight thickening. And Sarah made a decision forged entirely from desperation. She would see if the grate could open, if only to look at the space below, if only to find a place where she could survive one night while her mind worked on something more permanent. The padlock crumbled with barely any force. The grate was heavy, but she managed to heave it aside enough to see. Concrete steps plunging into absolute darkness. A cool breath rising from below, carrying the smell of earth and ancient metal. Sarah looked at Mina. "This is rather outlandish, isn't it?" Mina let out a quiet meow. "Yes, I agree. But what alternative do we have?" Sarah pulled a small flashlight from her purse, a habit from her practical upbringing that had never left her. She gathered the suitcase, secured the cat carrier, and began descending into the unknown. The stairs went down roughly 20 feet. Sarah counted 32 steps. The flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness, but what it found made Sarah catch her breath. Concrete walls lined with white tiles, cracked, grimy, but still holding together after decades. At the bottom of the stairs, a corridor stretched before her. Arched ceiling, maybe 8 feet overhead, also sheathed in white tile. The floor beneath her feet was concrete, blanketed in dust but dry, solid. And ahead, the corridor widened into something larger. She moved slowly, testing every step. The air was cool but not cold, dry, despite being buried underground. And the silence, that was the thing that struck her hardest. Total silence. Deep, swallowing silence, broken only by her own footsteps and Mina's soft mews echoing off tile. The wider space revealed itself gradually under the flashlight's sweep. A subway platform. Sarah stood there, light trembling in her grip, staring at a transit station from the 1930s, perfectly preserved, frozen. As though someone had simply locked the door one evening and the whole place held its breath for 80 years. The platform ran roughly 200 feet long, 20 feet across. White tile covered everything: walls, ceiling, the thick supporting columns. Brass light fixtures hung overhead, their bulbs dead for generations, but the metalwork still elegant, still proud. Vintage advertising posters from the 1940s clung to the walls. Products no one had bought in a lifetime. At the far end, the dark mouth of a train tunnel gaped open. To her right, a small room with a door that read "Station Manager." Sarah lowered her suitcase and the carrier, let Mina out and looked, really looked, at what surrounded her. Dust coated everything, thick as velvet. But the bones of this place were strong. No water damage she could find, no structural cracks worth worrying about. Tiles had fractured here and there, but held firm against the walls. And beneath it all, faintly, distantly, she could feel more than hear the rumble of modern subway trains passing through adjacent tunnels. The city's transit system ran close enough to feel. But this station had been severed from it, sealed off, abandoned when the lines were reconfigured sometime in the 1940s or 50s. A ghost station, erased from every map and forgotten by everyone alive. Sarah walked the full length of the platform. At the far end, another doorway. Utility rooms beyond it. One held ancient machinery, rusted into sculpture. But the next room, that room stopped her. Empty. 12 feet by 12 feet. Same white tile walls. A single brass fixture on the ceiling. Dry. Clean, relatively speaking. Private. It had a door that closed. Sarah stood in its center and listened. Nothing. Only her own breathing. For the first time in months, maybe years, something loosened inside her chest. A knot she had forgotten she carried. This place was hers, at least tonight. No one knew it existed. No one could take it from her. Robert's voice could not reach her here. His cruelty could not seep through these walls. She went back for her things, dragged the suitcase and carrier to the small, empty room, pulled clothes from the bag and spread them across the floor, a bed made of what remained of her life. It wasn't luxury, but it was no worse than the cheap hotel she'd considered and couldn't truly afford. Mina padded around the edges, nose working every corner, then circled twice on the makeshift bedding and settled with a purr that filled the quiet room. ___22__, Sarah whispered, then laughed. A real laugh, strange and raw in that buried place. Here she was, living in a forgotten subway passage, talking to her cat, and feeling more peace than she'd known in her sprawling mansion with its granite countertops and hollow rooms. That night, Sarah slept deeply. Darkness total, silence absolute. And when she woke, flashlight battery nearly spent, she made a choice that surprised no one more than herself. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because up there, on the surface, she was Sarah Mitchell, the discarded wife, the woman who lost everything. People would look at her with pity or look through her entirely. But down here, in this forgotten space beneath the city's feet, she was just Sarah, and she was free. She woke to perfect blackness. Panic seized her for one sharp second before memory caught up. The flashlight was dead. How long had she been sleeping? Hours, certainly. Maybe longer. Underground, time dissolved. There was no way to measure it. She fumbled for her phone. 6:47. She had slept nearly 10 hours, the deepest, most undisturbed rest she'd known in months. Mina lay curled against her side, warm and vibrating with a low, steady purr. Sarah ran her fingers through the cat's fur and let her mind work through the situation. She was living in an abandoned subway station. Absurd. And yet, remarkably sound. She had shelter, real shelter. A roof overhead, walls on every side, a door she could secure from within. The space was dry, structurally intact. She owed no rent, and not a soul knew she was here. The limitations were obvious. No electricity, no plumbing, no toilet, no heat beyond what the earth itself provided, and the constant threat of being found. But Sarah had $60,000 and no realistic path to steady work. $3,000 a month on rent would bleed her dry in 20 months. Living here, spending only on food and bare essentials, those funds could stretch for years, long enough to think, long enough to build something real, long enough maybe to reconstruct a life from nothing. She made her decision. She would stay. For now. Until something better revealed itself. That first full day, she devoted entirely to logistics. First priority, finding her way to the surface. The grate opened from below with a simple lever mechanism. She pushed through in the early morning hours when the streets sat empty, carefully repositioned the metal cover, then walked the surrounding blocks. A 24-hour diner 3 blocks south offered restrooms. She bought coffee and used their facilities to wash her face, brush her teeth. 2 blocks in another direction, a laundromat. 4 blocks further, a public library with electrical outlets and clean restrooms. A small grocery store that stayed open late. Everything she needed, all within walking distance of her underground dwelling. Sarah went shopping. Battery-powered LED lanterns, rechargeable batteries, a portable phone charger, bottled water, canned food, cleaning supplies, cat food, litter, a compact camping stove. $200 spent that first day, $3,000 saved. Over the following week, Sarah built a routine. Up early, surface before the neighborhood stirred, the diner restroom, days spent at the library or wandering the city. Then back underground each evening when darkness made her movements invisible. She began cleaning her small room. The dust surrendered easily. Decades of filth that needed only a broom and a damp cloth. Beneath the grime, the tiles gleamed white, an Art Deco pattern that must have looked elegant when the station first opened. In one of the utility rooms, she found old newspapers. Pages from the 1940s and 50s, yellowed but readable. She spread them as drop cloths while she scrubbed, then read them by lantern light in the evenings. They were fascinating. Windows into the city's history, into the lives of people who once passed through this station, heading to work or heading home. Mina took to the underground like she'd been born for it. The station offered endless corners to investigate, and within days she'd claimed her territory. She hunted the occasional mouse that crept in from the tunnels, keeping the space clean of vermin. She seemed perfectly satisfied with their strange new life. By the end of the second week, Sarah had shaped her small room into something approaching comfort. She'd found a discarded mattress behind a furniture store, far from perfect, but usable after thorough cleaning. Blankets, a pillow, a small rug from a second-hand shop. The room was beginning to feel less like survival and more like home. An underground sanctuary, peculiar and improbable, but hers, entirely hers. Sarah also started exploring the rest of the station. The platform itself was remarkable. 200 feet of pristine 1930s architecture stretched before her. Gleaming white tiles, opulent brass fixtures, vintage advertisements still clinging to the walls like ghosts of commerce. A concealed museum breathing beneath the city's feet. In the manager's office, she found the old station maps, dusty, forgotten, but perfectly intact. This had been Merchant Station, the stop that once served the financial district's beating heart. Decommissioned in 1952, the city had realigned its transit lines, bypassing this sector entirely and simply left it, sealed it away like a secret no one cared to keep. The tunnels stretched in both directions from the platform, disappearing into darkness. Sarah explored carefully, never straying beyond sight of the platform's edge. But what she could see told her enough. The tunnels were structurally sound. They connected to other abandoned stations. An entire forgotten kingdom existed beneath the streets above. 3 weeks after descending into this underground world, Sarah sat on the platform one evening. Mina curled warm in her lap. And something extraordinary settled over her like a blanket she hadn't known she needed. She was content. Not despite living in a subway station, because of it. She had found time. Time to reflect. Time to read. Time to simply exist without anyone's judgment pressing against her skin. She had space to grieve the death of her marriage, to release piece by piece the life that had been stripped from her hands. Down here she was not a failure. She was a survivor. And her journey, it was only beginning. 1 month into her subterranean life, the first real challenge surfaced: water. She had been buying bottled, but the cost gnawed at her limited funds, and the waste piled up around her like guilt. She needed something sustainable. So Sarah began examining her surroundings with the precise, methodical eye of an engineer. The tunnel stayed consistently cool, humid. Water droplets gathered on the pipes running along the ceiling, old steam pipes from the building above, long disconnected, but still drawing moisture from the earth overhead. Every morning, condensation formed on those pipes and dripped onto the platform below. Sarah conceived a plan. She placed clean containers beneath the drip points, positioned with care. Over 24 hours, nearly 2 gallons collected. It required filtration. She refused to risk contaminated water. But the volume was promising. She purchased a portable camping filter, the kind designed to strip bacteria and particulate matter from wilderness streams. Then she built a system. Collect the condensation. Pass it through progressively finer sieves to catch sediment. Then through the portable filter for final safety. The result? Clean, drinkable water. No recurring cost. For bathing, she arranged a camping shower bag, warmed on her portable stove. Not luxurious, but functional. Her body stayed clean. Her dignity stayed intact. The next obstacle was light. Battery-powered lanterns devoured replacements at an expense she couldn't sustain. She needed something lasting. Sarah began spending her days at the public library, buried in books about alternative energy, electrical systems, LED efficiency, solar panels, battery arrays. She absorbed it all. Then she built her plan. During daylight hours, she would visit the library carrying several power banks and rechargeable batteries. She'd plug them into available outlets while she read or used the public computers. The staff never noticed, never questioned it. People charged their phones there constantly. What difference did a few extra cables make? Each evening, she descended back underground, carrying fully charged batteries. These powered LED strip lights she'd installed along the walls and ceiling of her room, across sections of the platform. LEDs are astonishingly efficient. A single power bank could illuminate her living space for days on end. She built a rotation schedule, 8 power banks cycling between library and tunnel, 2 carried up each day for recharging, 6 always ready and operational below. The system cost nothing beyond the initial equipment purchase. Next, food preservation. The tunnel held a naturally cool temperature, roughly 60 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, but she needed genuine refrigeration for perishables. A compact refrigerator was beyond her means, and even if she could afford one, she had no way to power it. Sarah built an evaporative cooling system instead, a box wrapped in damp cloth, positioned where air moved freely. As moisture left the fabric, temperatures inside dropped several degrees. Not a refrigerator, but enough to keep food fresh far longer than it should have lasted. Each rough-hewn solution she pieced together quietly restored something Robert had spent years tearing down. She started noticing patterns in what the city threw away. Bakeries tossed bread that was 1 day old. Grocery stores discarded produce with the smallest blemish. Coffee shops dumped pastries the moment they locked their doors. None of it was garbage. It was perfectly good food, wasted for no real reason. Sarah swallowed her pride and began collecting it. She would wait until shops went dark, then pull usable items from their bins. The first few times stung. Humiliation sat heavy in her chest. But that feeling faded quickly, replaced by something sharper. This wasn't desperation. This was intelligence. She was cutting waste and keeping herself fed for almost nothing. 6 weeks underground, and Sarah had pulled off something extraordinary. Her monthly expenses had dropped below $500, everything included. The settlement money that should have run dry in 20 months could now stretch a decade if it needed to. But the money wasn't the real discovery. Sarah had uncovered something far more valuable: herself. She was resourceful in ways she'd never been allowed to test. All those years propping up Robert, running the household, coordinating their social calendar down to the last detail. She hadn't been wasting her abilities, she'd been sharpening them. Problem-solving, engineering, creative thinking. Every skill had been there, buried under someone else's life. Robert had called her unemployable, said she lacked practical skills. He was wrong about everything. Sarah had extraordinary life skills. She'd simply never been given room to use them. Now, standing inside the underground world she'd built with her own hands, surrounded by systems she'd designed from nothing, she felt something she couldn't remember ever feeling before. Real accomplishment. Not the borrowed kind, not reflected glory from someone else's career. Hers. She wasn't just surviving down here, she was thriving, and what she'd created was about to become something even more remarkable. 2 months after descending into that forgotten passageway, Sarah had transformed her abandoned subway station into a space stunning enough to grace the pages of a design magazine. It started with the tiles. She'd been restoring them in small sections, slow, patient work. As decades of filth came away, what emerged underneath took her breath. Delicate white subway tiles, inlaid with Art Deco patterns, emerald green and gold catching the light. The original architects had built something beautiful down here, a space meant to brighten the ordinary commute of thousands. Their vision had been buried under years of neglect. Sarah was bringing it back. She worked with surgical care, spending hours each day scrubbing with salvaged cleaning solutions and old toothbrushes. The work became ritual, meditative. Each tile she uncovered felt like uncovering a piece of herself, something beautiful that had always been there, just hidden beneath the grime. The central platform became her living room. She furnished it one piece at a time. Everything pulled from sidewalks, marked free or left curbside on collection days. The city's wealthy discarded astonishing things, and Sarah had developed an eye for quality buried in the cast-offs. A mid-century modern sofa, leather-worn soft but still elegant, needing nothing more than a good cleaning. An Art Deco side table that looked like it had been made for this station. An oriental rug with gently faded colors that only deepened its beauty. A brass floor lamp requiring new wiring, but otherwise perfect. She found stacks of books outside a bookstore that was closing its doors. Classics, art volumes, novels. She built shelving from salvaged timber and lined an entire wall of the platform with them, her own private library underground. Her found art, paintings and prints that strangers had abandoned during relocations or gut jobs. None of it gallery-worthy, but each piece carried its own quiet dignity. She mounted them along the walls, and the tunnel became something between a corridor and a curated exhibition. The transformation defied reason. What had been a lightless, forsaken platform now breathed like a loft apartment, marrying 1930s elegance with the rough poetry of rescued objects. White and green tiles shone beneath the light. Brass fixtures Sarah had scrubbed for hours threw back the warm hum of LED glow. Furniture stood in clusters, conversation circles, reading corners, intimate pockets of calm. Her small adjoining room became the bedroom, a found mattress dressed in thrift store linens, a bookshelf, a compact desk, a salvaged mirror she'd reframed with her own hands. The old station manager's office she claimed as a study, a still, quiet chapel for reading and thinking and scheming forward. Desk, chair, filing cabinet, a curtain hung across the doorway for privacy. The abandoned utility room became pantry and supply closet, lined with shelves and containers in careful order. 3 months underground, And Sarah's home was genuinely beautiful. Eccentric, yes. Unconventional, absolutely. But it held a beauty her former mansion had never possessed. Because this space belonged entirely to her. Every object, every arrangement, every single detail reflected her own eye, her own imagination. No directives from Robert, no obligations to anyone else's taste. She started photographing it all with her phone, not for anyone to see, just proof, a private record of distance traveled. Looking at those images, she could barely connect them to the dusty, dead platform she'd first stepped onto months before. She also began writing again, a pursuit she'd silenced during her marriage. Now, with solitude stretching in every direction, she kept a journal. She chronicled the work, the process of pulling beauty from neglect, the slow, startling discovery of what she could actually do when no one was watching. One evening, Sarah on her salvage sofa, Mina curled warm against her side, a book open under the soft lamp glow, she heard something that froze her blood. A creak. Not from above, from below, from within the tunnel itself. She killed the lights instantly. Absolute blackness swallowed the platform. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She held her breath. Mina went rigid beside her. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer through the tunnel. Sarah's thoughts scattered and reformed. 3 months undetected. Had it finally ended? A light appeared, a flashlight beam cutting across the platform. Sarah pressed herself behind the sofa, invisible in the dark. The beam lingered on her living space. It found the furniture, the books, the unmistakable evidence of someone inhabiting this place. Then a voice, male, startled. Quote 23 __. The flashlight advanced. Sarah could make out a shape now. A man in a utility uniform, transit authority badge on his chest. She'd been found. It was finished. Sarah stood slowly, hands raised, palms open. "Please," she said, "I can explain." The transit worker, young, maybe 30, his face carved with pure disbelief, stared at her, then at the space, then back at her. "You're living here? In Old Merchant Station?" "Yes," Sarah said. "No point in pretending otherwise. I'm sorry. I know I'm trespassing. I fell. I'll leave. Just, please, don't call the police." He lowered the flashlight from her eyes. "How long have you been down here?" 3 months. 3 months, he echoed. His gaze traveled across the furnished platform, the polished tiles, the obvious labor Sarah had poured into every surface. I don't even know what to say. This is incredible." Sarah blinked. "You're not going to arrest me?" "I'm not a cop. I'm just a maintenance worker running checks on the old tunnels for structural problems." He stepped onto the platform, surveying what she'd done. Sarah asked. He ran his fingers along one of the cleaned tile walls. Sarah nodded. The worker, his name tag read Miguel, shook his head slowly, something like awe crossing his face. Quote 39. He swept his arm across the space. Quote 40. Quote 41. Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miguel studied her with careful eyes. Quote 42. Sarah paused. Then she decided truth was the only thing she had left to offer. She told him, briefly, about the divorce, the settlement, the humiliation, and how she'd stumbled upon this tunnel. Miguel listened without a flicker of judgment. When she finished, he said, "I should report this. Technically, you're trespassing on Transit Authority property." "I know," Sarah said. "I understand. I'll have everything packed by tomorrow." "But," Miguel went on, "technically, my job only requires me to report safety hazards, and you are clearly not a safety hazard. If anything, you've improved the property." A small smile crossed his lips. "So, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to file a report stating that Merchant Station is structurally sound and requires no immediate action, and I'm going to forget I ever saw you here." Tears pressed against the backs of Sarah's eyes. Quote 49, quote 50. He pulled a card from his pocket and placed it in her hand. Quote 51, quote 52, quote 53, he said, quote 54. After he left, Sarah sat in the stillness for a long time, letting everything settle. She had steeled herself to lose it all again, and instead found an ally she never expected. The next morning, fueled by her close call and Miguel's quiet generosity, Sarah turned her attention to something she'd been putting off. A water leak in the far utility room. Moisture seeped through a crack in the wall, not enough to flood, but enough to keep everything damp, persistently, stubbornly damp. She'd meant to seal it weeks ago, but never had the right materials. Now, she examined the wall closely. The leak originated behind a metal panel that looked like it had been installed sometime in the 1940s or 50s, decades newer than the station's original 1930s construction. Sarah gathered tools from her salvaged collection: a screwdriver, a pry bar, a hammer. She worked at the panel's edges, fighting for leverage. Rust held it in place like clenched teeth. But eventually, it gave. Behind the panel was a hollow space within the wall, and inside that space sat a metal door, a vault door, roughly 3 feet square, fitted with a mechanical combination lock. Sarah's pulse climbed. She pried away more paneling, exposing the vault's full face. It sat embedded deep in the wall, clearly installed when the bank above, the Merchants and Trust Bank, was still operating before its closure in the 1970s. A bank vault, and given its location, hidden behind a secondary panel, buried beneath a forgotten station, this was a vault that no one remembered existed. Sarah tried the handle. Locked, of course. The combination dial was old, purely mechanical. She had no way to open it. She sat back on her heels, stared at the steel face. Her mind turned over and over. What was inside? Old paperwork? Currency? Perhaps nothing at all. For 2 weeks, Sarah threw herself into research. Every day at the library, hunched over records about the Merchants and Trust Bank. She discovered it had been a mid-sized financial institution, one that collapsed in 1973 when the banking crisis swept through like a plague. Its assets were liquidated, its records supposedly handed off to the acquiring bank. But what if some of those records had slipped through the cracks? What if this vault held files that had been sealed, forgotten, abandoned to decades of silence? Sarah dug into vault cracking next. What she found was sobering. For an amateur, it bordered on impossible. These old mechanical locks were built with real sophistication. But older vaults, she also learned, sometimes yielded to default factory combinations common in that era. She tracked down a compiled list of standard combinations used by major vault manufacturers in the 1930s and 50s. Hundreds of entries on that list. But Sarah had something most people didn't. She had time. Every evening she worked through combinations one by one, patient, methodical, recording each failed attempt in a notebook. On her 63rd try, the lock gave way with a clean, satisfying click. Inside stood metal file boxes, stacked in neat rows. Sarah pulled the first one free and lifted the lid. Financial records, ledgers, papers yellowed with age, all dating back to the 1970s, all bearing the name Merchants and Trust Bank. As she began reading, the weight of what she'd found settled over her like a stone. This was evidence of massive financial fraud, tax evasion schemes, offshore account records, lists of wealthy clients who had used the bank to hide money from authorities. Her hands began to shake as she reached for more boxes, dozens of them, years of documentation cataloguing illicit financial dealings. And there, on one client list, flagged in a bank manager's handwritten notes as high priority, requiring absolute discretion, was a name Sarah knew better than her own: Robert Mitchell, her ex-husband. Sarah spent 3 days inside that vault, going through every document with surgical precision. Page by page, her shock hardened into something colder, something sharper. Robert's wealth had never come solely from legitimate business. He had been funneling money offshore, since the early 2000s, a practice that started long before their divorce, a practice that ran quietly through the entire length of their marriage. Millions had moved through the Merchants and Trust Bank and other institutions into accounts scattered across the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Luxembourg. The records showed transactions totaling more than $15 million shifted offshore between 2002 and 2012. None of it declared to tax authorities. Not a single dollar. Robert had committed fraud on a massive scale, and during their divorce, he had stood before a judge, claimed limited assets, and forced Sarah to accept a settlement that left her with almost nothing, while $15 million sat hidden in accounts she never knew existed. Sarah photographed every page, thousands of documents. She organized them with the same care she'd once brought to running a household no one appreciated. Digital copies went into multiple secure cloud accounts. Then she began the real work, understanding exactly how to use what she'd found. Weeks at the library followed. She studied tax fraud, divorce fraud, criminal financial reporting procedures. She combed through publicly accessible legal databases. She learned how to report financial crimes anonymously. She even contacted an attorney, not face-to-face, but through an encrypted email service. She laid out a hypothetical situation. What would happen if someone discovered evidence of tax fraud committed by an ex-spouse, particularly if that fraud had tainted a divorce settlement? The attorney's answer left no room for doubt. Divorce settlements built on fraudulent financial disclosures could be reopened. Hidden assets could be seized, with a portion potentially awarded to the spouse who'd been deceived. And the person responsible for the fraud? Criminal prosecution. Sarah had every piece she needed. But she didn't rush. She waited. 4 months after opening the vault, Sarah sent her first anonymous package. It went to the Fraud Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Inside, copies of Robert's offshore account records, bank documents tracing the transfers, and a precise timeline mapping every financial movement. A note came with the package. It read, "Robert Mitchell has evaded roughly $4.2 million in federal taxes over 10 years. Evidence enclosed. A concerned citizen." 1 week later, a second package landed at the State Tax Authority. Similar documentation, similar precision. 1 week after that, a third package reached her divorce attorney. The note was direct. "You represented me in Mitchell versus Mitchell. Your client, me, was defrauded. Robert Mitchell concealed $15 million in offshore accounts during our marriage and divorce. Evidence enclosed. My settlement was built on lies. Please file to reopen immediately." The final package went to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District, the jurisdiction that prosecutes financial crimes. This one held everything, the full scope of Robert's fraud, organized with meticulous care. Every transaction, every hidden account, every lie, documented and dated. Then Sarah set it all down, and she waited. 6 weeks of silence, 6 weeks of nothing. But when the silence broke, it broke like thunder. Sarah discovered what had happened the way millions of people discover things, through a screen. She was at the library, using a public computer, when a headline stopped her cold. "Local businessman arrested in major tax fraud case." The article laid it bare. Federal charges against Robert Mitchell. Tax evasion, fraud, financial crimes spanning more than a decade. Federal agents had raided his offices, raided his home, his bank accounts, frozen. Every one of them. He faced up to 20 years in prison, millions in fines, millions in back taxes. The article quoted Robert's attorney. __quote _58___. Sarah smiled at that, a quiet smile. The documents were not falsified. They were authenticated, dated, irrefutable bank records pulled from the belly of his own deception. 2 days later, her divorce attorney called. He'd had her number for months but couldn't reach her. Quote, 59, quote. His voice was urgent. quote, 60, quote, 61, quote, she said, calm, unhurried, quote, 62, quote, 63, quote, 64, quote, 65, quote. The attorney pressed on. The room tilted. $10 million. Her hands gripped the edge of whatever was nearest. The attorney added, over the next 3 months, she watched Robert's empire come apart at the seams. The federal investigation deepened. The IRS seized his offshore accounts. The divorce case reopened, and Robert's fraudulent disclosures were laid bare in open court. He fought it. Of course he fought it. His expensive attorneys argued every motion, delayed every hearing, contested every filing. But bank records do not lie. They sit there, patient and absolute, and they do not lie. The original settlement was annulled. New proceedings began, and this time Sarah held the leverage. She negotiated through her attorney, never appeared in person, not once. She was entitled to half of all marital assets, including the offshore funds he had hidden from her. She was entitled to the house. She was entitled to compensation for his fraud. The final settlement awarded Sarah $8.2 million in cash and assets, plus the house, valued at $2.8 million. Robert's remaining net worth shrank to roughly $3 million, most of which would vanish into legal fees, government fines, and back taxes owed. He had tried to erase her through cruelty and lies, methodically, deliberately, and now he was the one being erased. Sarah, sitting in her underground palace beneath the city, reading about his collapse in the newspaper, she felt something shift inside her chest. Justice. Not revenge, not spite. Justice. A feeling she hadn't known in years, settling into her bones like warmth returning to frozen hands. 6 months after sending that first package, Sarah stood in front of the Merchants and Trust Bank building, now sleek, renovated, converted into luxury condominiums, and dialed a number. __quote, _69, __. Eduardo Torres was a city official who oversaw unused municipal properties. Sarah had reached out to him 3 weeks prior with an unusual proposition. Quote, 70, quote, he said. Quote, 71, quote. Sarah smiled. Quote, 72, quote. The price was $2.1 million, a significant sum for an abandoned subway station, but Sarah held cards the city didn't want played. She had painstakingly documented the station's historical value, its architectural grace, the ambitious future she envisioned for it. She had also made it quietly known that if the city refused her offer, she held evidence of illegal waste dumping in several other abandoned stations. The kind of evidence that could ignite a public relations disaster. The city was eager to sell. With this purchase, Sarah would legally own the station. She could live there without looking over her shoulder. She could build what had been taking shape in her mind for months. 2 weeks later, the paperwork was complete. Sarah was the legal owner of the merchant station and its interconnected tunnels. After the purchase price and legal fees, she retained $6 million from her settlement. She brought in architects and contractors, walked them through the space, laid out her vision, transforming this forgotten station into a living cultural center. The platform would become a performance venue for music, theater, art. The utility rooms would house artist studios. The tunnels would serve as gallery corridors. The architects stood there, turning slowly, looking up at the vaulted ceilings. Quote, 73, one of them said. Quote, 74. Sarah poured $3 million into the renovation. Electrical systems, plumbing, ventilation, all professionally overhauled. Skilled artisans restored the original tilework by hand. Safety features went in. Accessibility modifications followed. A discreet entrance was constructed, connecting to the building above, which Sarah had purchased for an additional $1 million. 9 months after discovering the vault, the Merchants Cultural Center opened its doors. The response was immediate, overwhelming. The transformed space drew praise from architectural magazines as a stunning example of adaptive reuse. Artists competed for studio space. Musicians booked the performance platform months ahead. The gallery tunnels hosted rotating exhibitions that pulled crowds underground. And Sarah, the woman once labeled unemployable, told she lacked essential skills, became the director and owner of one of the city's most innovative cultural institutions. She gave interviews rarely, always measured. She told the story of stumbling upon a derelict station and seeing what it could become. But she never mentioned living there, never mentioned sleeping underground. The vault and the documents inside it remained her secrets alone, private truths she carried quietly. The cultural center generated modest revenue, enough to cover operations and pay a small staff. Sarah didn't need the income. She still had $2 million from her settlement, conservatively invested, yielding more than enough to sustain her. She had also acquired a small apartment directly above the center, a legal, above-board home. Yet she spent most of her time below, in the station, in the cramped space that had once been her first dwelling underground. She kept it exactly as it was, unchanged, a reminder of where she started, of what nothing looked like before her hands turned it into something. 1 year after her divorce, a message arrived through her attorney. Robert wanted to meet. He was staring down a courtroom, almost certainly a conviction, possibly a cell. He said he wanted to apologize. Sarah gave his request exactly 10 seconds of her attention. Then she answered. No. She didn't need his remorse. Didn't want it. He had played his part, the force that broke her open so she could rebuild. Beyond that, he was nothing. 2 years past the divorce, Sarah sat in her underground sanctuary. Legally recognized now, beautifully restored. Mina curled nearby, and Sarah was writing an article for a major magazine. She called it __, quote _75, __. Every word was raw. She wrote about losing everything, about the despair that swallowed her whole, about building a new life from scraps other people had thrown away. She wrote about the vault, the evidence she'd pulled from its walls, how it shifted everything. She wrote about justice, about making something from nothing, about the strange beauty hiding in places the world forgot. The article spread like wildfire. Thousands of messages flooded in, from people who'd been sidelined, divorced, discarded. The same words kept appearing. __, quote _76, __. Sarah answered as many as she could, the same message over and over. __, quote _77, __. She told them to find their own tunnel, build their own palace, and she reminded them, the people who throw you away often carry secrets of their own. Be patient, be sharp, and when the moment comes, stand firm and take back what's yours. 3 years after the divorce, Sarah stood on the platform of the Merchants Cultural Center during a live performance. A string quartet played Beethoven inside that elegantly restored, tile-lined space, a place once swallowed by neglect, reclaimed by her hands. Mina, older now but still faithful, sat at her side. Hundreds filled the platform, people who had stumbled upon this hidden world beneath the city. Sarah watched them, and her mind drifted to Robert. Right then, he was serving his 2nd year of a 7-year sentence for tax evasion. He had been so certain he'd destroyed her, left her with nothing, left her begging. Instead, she had found a forgotten kingdom and filled it with light. She had uncovered his secrets and used them to rebuild her life. She had taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and shaped it into something extraordinary. She had been thrown away. But down there in the dark where she landed, she found everything she needed to rise. If Sarah's story spoke to something inside you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We share stories of people who turned their hardest seasons into their greatest chapters. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been betrayed? Cast aside? Did you find strength you didn't know existed in your lowest moment? Tell us. Someone scrolling through these words tonight might need exactly what you have to say. Sarah teaches something that cuts deep, about resilience, about justice, about the power of waiting. She proves that rock bottom can become a foundation. When she first climbed down into that abandoned tunnel, carrying nothing but a cat and a single suitcase, she wasn't falling. She was finding solid ground. Sometimes, losing everything means shedding everything that was holding you back. She shows that creativity is survival. Sarah didn't just endure underground, she thrived. Water collection systems, improvised lighting, salvaged furniture given new purpose, spaces reimagined from ruin into something whole. She proved that a sharp mind and stubborn hands are worth more than any fortune. Most critically, Sarah teaches us that justice belongs to those who refuse to rush. She could have exposed Robert the moment she found the truth. She didn't. She documented everything, every transaction, every lie, every trail he thought he'd buried. She chose the moment of revelation like a surgeon chooses where to cut, with precision that left nothing to chance. When she finally moved, his collapse was total, and her future was secured by her own hands. For anyone who has been betrayed, for anyone who was discarded like yesterday's mail, for anyone who was told their worth had expired, remember Sarah. Remember that those who throw you away often carry secrets they pray you never find. Remember that patience and careful documentation and strategic timing can transform cruelty into your greatest weapon. Thank you for walking alongside Sarah through this journey, from abandonment to something far greater than revenge. Share this story with someone who needs reminding that landing at the bottom does not mean defeat. Sometimes it means you've finally found the foundation strong enough to build on.